Welcome to the next video. This particular coding assignment is called Another 10 SQL Database Questions. And this particular assignment is going to be centered around podcast. So before we actually get into the assignment, I want to break down each one of the tables that we're going to be using. The first table is going to be called the podcast table. Now, this is just going to be a table that holds information about the particular podcast, such as the podcast ID, the podcast name, podcast type, as well as the founded year. The next table is the host table. This table is just going to contain some information about the host, such as the host ID, full name, as well as the podcast ID. Last but not least would be the earnings table. This particular table is going to hold information relating to the earnings of each of the podcasts. This table is going to consist of the earnings ID. It's also going to consist of the earnings for each month for a particular podcast. And it's also going to consist of the yearly earnings, which is the total of all the month's earnings for a particular earning year. And then it's also going to consist of a podcast ID. And I've already created these tables and I've already populated these tables with some records. And I have that displayed on this next page here. So, for example, you see on the screen now, there's a podcast table. This podcast table, it consists of 4 columns: podcast ID, podcast name, podcast type, as well as the founded year. So as you can see, I've already populated it with records. If we just take one of the records here, for example, Beautiful World Podcast, the podcast type is travel, and the year it was founded is 2010. So this is pretty straightforward. The next table is going to be the host table. This is a pretty small table, but it simply just includes some information about the host. It has a host ID, the full name of the host, as well as a podcast ID. So if we just take another record, for example, the host ID number 7, and the full name is Andrew Black, and the podcast ID is 5. Last but not least is going to be the earnings table. So as you can see, this is a pretty large table, and this table is going to keep track of the earnings that a particular podcast makes every month, as well as the total yearly earnings. Also, it's going to specify the earning year where a specific podcast made a certain amount of money. So this is pretty straightforward, but these are all the tables that we're going to be using. So let's now get to the assignment. This is our assignment. We're going to need to write an SQL query statement to return the following. So as you can see here, we have 10 points here, and we're going to need to write SQL query statements that satisfy each one of these 10 points. So I'm going to go through them one by one. We're going to need to write an SQL query statement that returns all hosts associated with the Punchline Central podcast. Number 2, we're going to return the earnings of the Whip Freak podcast for the month of January in 2005. Number 3, we're going to return the podcast and salary with the highest earnings ever, specifically for the month of July. Number 4, we're going to return the number of hosts for the Dino Stories podcast. Number 5, return all podcasts founded before 2019. Number 6, return the podcast with the lowest yearly earnings in 2014. Number 7, return the podcast and earnings with highest yearly earnings ever. Number 8, in the month of February, March, April, and May, how much did the Beautiful World podcast make in 2010? Number 9, name of the host that made the highest yearly salary in 2022. And finally, number 10, return the podcast type with the lowest yearly earnings ever. So with all that being said, without further ado, let's jump right into the code. Alright guys, welcome to the coding portion of this video. What we're going to be doing in this part of the video is writing some SQL queries. But before we jump into that, I wanted to show you guys that I've already created my 3 tables that we're going to be using. The podcast table, the host table, as well as the earnings table. So as you can see here, I have a select statement. If I run this, I have the entire table here with 4 columns. The podcast ID, podcast name, podcast type, as well as the founded year. If we execute the command on the host table, we're going to get 3 columns, which consists of the host ID, the full name, as well as the podcast ID. And lastly would be the earnings table. This table consists of all these columns here. We have the earnings ID, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, yearly earnings, earnings year, and the podcast ID. So what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be executing each one of the questions that I asked in the presentation that you just saw. So these are the questions here. Let me just first of all zoom this in for you guys. Okay, so this is the first query that we need to implement. This query is going to do this. It's going to return all hosts associated with the Punchline Central podcast. And in order to return all hosts associated with this podcast, we're going to need to execute this query. Select h dot full name from podcast p join host h on p dot podcast id equals h dot podcast id, where p dot podcast name equals Punchline Central. Okay, so before we execute this, I want you guys to understand what's going on here. So as you see in this query, we have selected the full name. We are then going to be using these 2 tables in our from clause here. Podcast table as well as the host table. We are then going to connect both of these tables based on the podcast ID. So these are how these tables are going to be connected. And then what we're going to be doing is specifying this where clause where we're going to specify the name of the podcast, which is p.podcast name. So if we go ahead and run this, let's see what we get. The full name will be Andrew Black. So the host that is associated with the Punchline Central podcast is Andrew Black. And we can also confirm this by just executing this select all from podcast query. And if we look for Punchline Central, we see that the podcast ID is 5. And if we execute the table here for the host, podcast ID is 5, and the host name is in fact Andrew Black. Okay, so that's all for that query. Next, we're going to move on to number 2. And number 2 says return the earnings of the Whip Freak podcast for the month of January in 2005. So in order to do that, what we're going to need to do is first of all go select e.January from podcast p join earnings e on p dot podcast id equals e dot podcast id. Where Let me see. Get some space down here. Okay, so we're just gonna go where p dot podcast name equals whip freak and e dot earning year equals 2005. Okay, so let's explain what's going on here. So once again, we're going to be returning the earnings of the Whip Freak podcast for the month of January in 2005. So we're going to be returning the earnings for January, and we're going to be using these two tables, the podcast table as well as the earnings table. And we're going to connect these two tables based on the podcast ID, where the p.podcast name equals to Whip Freak and the earnings year is 2005. So if we execute this, see what we get. We get the value of 600. And this is the correct answer. This is the earnings of the Whip Freak podcast for the month of January in 2005. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is move on to number 3. And number 3 is going to be this. We're going to be returning the podcast and the salary with the highest earnings ever, specifically for the month of July. Okay? So we're just going to go select p.podcast name e.july from earnings e join podcast p. I'm going to put this on a new line so I can just have some consistency. From earnings E join podcast P on E dot podcast ID P dot podcast ID where E dot July equals select max July from earnings. All right, so let's explain what's going on here. So once again, we're just wanting to return the podcast and the salary with the highest earnings. We want to return the podcast and instead of salary, let's say earnings, with the highest earnings ever, specifically for the month of July. So we're going to return the podcast name as well as the earnings for July. We're going to be using these two tables, the earnings table as well as the podcast table. Going to connect them once again based on podcast ID, where July, E.July, is going to be equal to the maximum earnings in July. So this is not for any specified year or anything. It's just the maximum earnings for July among all the records. And if we were to run this, see what we get. The podcast name is called Christian Vibes. So just to double check this, we can go to our earnings table and look up the highest earnings for the month of July throughout all the records. So we could just go to this table, select all from earnings, go to the month of July. We can just sort this by clicking. Okay, the highest earnings for the month of July is this record right here, which says 7,000. If you move over, that will be the podcast ID of 4. Now, what is the podcast ID of 4? Christian Vibes, which is exactly what we get when we execute this query. No, well, this query, actually. All right. So, moving right along, we're going to move to number 4. Return the number of hosts for the Dino Stories podcast. Okay, so we're going to go something like this. We're going to go select count h.full name as total host number from host H join podcast P on h.podcast ID equals p.podcast ID, where p.podcast name equals Dino Stories. Okay, so this should be pretty straightforward. We're pretty much just wanting to return the number of hosts for the Dino Stories podcast. So we just want to go select count full name. So this count is meaning we're going to get a count of the host name. And we're pretty much just going to name the column as total host number. And then we're going to be using these two tables, host table as well as the podcast table. We're going to connect them based on the podcast ID, where the p.podcast name equals Dino Stories. So if we just go up here, execute this query, we'll get 2. So there are 2 hosts that are associated with the podcast Dino Stories. So we can actually double check this. Dino Stories. Podcast ID is 8. Podcast ID is 8. This is 8. This is 8. There are 2 hosts. Samantha Belaine and Ruth Gaff. Those are the 2 hosts of Dino Stories. All right. The next question is this. We're going to need to return all podcasts founded before 2019. So this should be pretty straightforward. Just going to go select all from podcast where founded year is lesser than 2019. Execute this. And this will return all the podcasts that were founded before 2019. All right. Moving right along. Number 6. Return the podcast with the lowest yearly earnings in 2014. In order to do this, we would need a select p.podcast name min e.yearly earnings as lowest yearly earning. From podcast P, join earnings E on p.podcast ID e.podcast ID, where e.earning year equals 2014. And this should be it. Okay, so let's explain what's going on right here. We're going to need to return the podcast with the lowest year earnings in 2014. So we're going to be returning the podcast name. And we can also print out the earnings. Even though this just says return the podcast with the lowest yearly earnings, we could remove this, but I pretty much just added this so that you guys would have a better understanding of what the yearly earning would be. So I would rather just print that out as well. So we're going to be returning the podcast name as well as the lowest yearly earnings. And we're going to be using these two tables, podcast table as well as the earnings table. We're going to connect them by podcast ID. And I'm going to specify in that where clause that the earning year would need to be 2014. So it's going to return us the lowest yearly earnings in 2014. We can execute this, run it, and we're going to get 8635 in 2014. So if we go to the My Lovely Stage podcast, we can actually go here, My Lovely Stage podcast. Podcast ID is 1. We then go to our earnings table. One, 2014. This is looking like the lowest in 2014. So as you see, we have 3 records. This record, and this record. And My Lovely Stage, the yearly earnings in 2014 was the lowest, $8,635. All right. Now we're going to be moving on to number 7. Number 7 is we're going to need to return the podcast and the earnings with the highest yearly earnings ever. We're just going to go select, just make some space. All right. So we're just going to go select p.podcast name e.yearly earnings from earnings e join podcast p e dot podcast ID equals p dot podcast ID. Well, if we got our on where e dot yearly earnings equals select max yearly earnings from earnings. Okay, so once again, we're going to be returning the podcast and earnings with the highest yearly earnings ever. So to fully break this query down, we are selecting the podcast name as well as the yearly earnings. These are what's going to be returned. These two are going to be returned. We're going to be using these two tables. Once again, earnings table as well as the podcast table. We're going to connect them based on the podcast ID. And in our where clause, we're going to specify that the earnings year is going to be the maximum yearly earnings. So we're going to return a podcast that has the highest yearly earnings among all the records in the earnings table. So just go something like this. And let's see. Okay, so what it's saying is that we spelled something wrong. It's probably this. Yearly earnings. See if this fixes it. Okay, so the Christian Vibes podcast has the highest yearly earnings. And we can always double check this. Go to the podcast table. Christian Vibes podcast. Podcast ID is 4. Right here, podcast ID is 4. This is the highest. Christian Vibes podcast. All right. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is number 8. And for number 8, we're going to be doing this. So in the months of February, March, April, and May, how much did the Beautiful World podcast make in 2010? So in order to do this, what we need to do is create ourselves a select statement. Select p.podcast name sum. We can get the sum of all these months. February. March, April, and we're gonna actually add a plus here. May, as total amount of specified months from podcast P join earnings E on p.podcast ID equals e.podcast ID, where p.podcast name equals Beautiful World, and p.founded year equals 2010. Okay, so this should be pretty straightforward. And if you guys have any questions, make sure to always just leave them in the comments below. But I'm going to break this query down. So once again, we're going to be doing this. We're going to be executing this query. So in the months of February, March, April, and May, how much did the Beautiful World podcast make in 2010? So I'm going to select the podcast name, and then I want to get a sum of all of these months. I want to get an earning sum of all of these months: February, March, April, and May. And then I'm going to be using these two tables, podcast table, earnings table, connect them based on the podcast ID. And then in this where clause, I'm just going to say the p.podcast name is going to be the Beautiful World, and the founded year has to be 2010. Let's see what we get. Okay, so the Beautiful World podcast made $25,835 in the combination of these months. So basically, the total earnings for the Beautiful World podcast for the months of February, March, April, and May in 2010 is $25,835. We're going to move on to number 9 now. And for number 9, we're going to be naming the host that made the biggest or the highest yearly salary in 2022. All right, so we're just going to go select H.full name max E.yearly earnings from host H join earnings E on E.podcast ID equals H.podcast ID, where E.earnings earning year equals 2022. Okay, so what we have here is we have a select statement, and we're going to be returning the full name as well as the max yearly earnings. So the name of the host as well as the max yearly earnings that made the highest salary in 2022. Okay, in this query, we're pretty much just going to be using the host table again, as well as the earnings table. Going to connect them based on podcast ID, where E.earnings year equals 2022. So if we run this, what do we get? Okay, it's saying we having an error here. Yearly earnings. Yearly earnings. All right. Drew Blake. Okay, so Drew Blake, he is the host that made the highest yearly salary in the year of 2022. So as you see, I want to point something out. It said the highest yearly salary of 2022, and we are currently in 2022, but all this is just sample data. The year hasn't ended yet, but all these records I have, this is pretty much just sample data that I wanted to use to execute these SQL queries. All right, so last but not least, we have number 10. So what does number 10 say? Number 10 says return the podcast type with the lowest yearly earnings ever. So in order to do that, we need to go something like this. Select P.podcast type min E.yearly earnings as lowest yearly earnings ever from podcast P join earnings E on P.podcast ID E.podcast ID. All right, so this should be the proper query here. So what we're doing once again is we're going to be returning the podcast type with the lowest yearly earnings ever. So we have in the select statement the podcast type and then the minimum yearly earnings. We're going to be using the podcast and the earnings table. We're going to connect them based on the podcast ID, and this should return the podcast type with the lowest yearly earnings among all of those earnings records. Okay, so it's an unknown column podcast type. Let me just double check. Still getting an error. Let's see. Oh, I see here. We didn't specify the P. Okay, so there we go. Now this should work. All right, so the podcast type is a love podcast. Lowest yearly earnings ever is $717. And this is pretty much it. Also, as always, guys, if you have any questions, make sure to just leave them in the comments below. And I'll try to get back to you if you need any help with this. And also, if you want me to send you over the actual tables, let me know in the comments and I can share that with you guys as well. Since the theme of this video is centered around podcasts, I wanted to quickly shout out my friend. If there's anybody out there who's watching this video that is interested in starting a podcast yourself, I have a friend who actually helps content creators start their first podcast. My friend's name is Lloyd George Jr. Feel free to follow him on Instagram, TikTok, or his website, lloydnotgeorge.com. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like the video if you feel like you've learned something from here. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.